On a cold March morning in 1892, a group of men walked up the hill toward Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. At the front of the small procession was a local farmer named George Brown. Behind him came the town's doctor, the village pastor, and several neighbors who had agreed to witness what was about to happen. They were not there for a funeral. They stood before the receiving vault, the heavy stone crypt where the dead were stored during the hard New England winter. Inside lay the body of George's daughter, Mercy. She had been placed there in January, 2 months earlier. Now, with his remaining son growing thinner by the week, George had agreed to something that would have sounded medieval to the outside world. They would open Mercy's grave and examine her body for signs that she was, in some way, still feeding on the living. By the time the men reached the plot, Mercy's family had already lost several members to consumption. George's wife, Mary, had died first, then their eldest daughter, Mary Olive. For 7 years, the house had been quiet. The family thought they were safe, but then the coughing returned. Now his son Edwin lay ill, wasting away. Neighbors and relatives suggested a remedy that did not appear in medical textbooks. The problem, they said, lay with the dead rather than the living. The procedure that followed did not resemble a secret midnight ritual. It took place in daylight, in front of witnesses. The local doctor, Harold Metcalf, examined the remains. According to later accounts, Mercy's body seemed oddly preserved for someone buried in winter. Her heart contained liquid blood. In the logic of the time, these details matched a pattern people thought they understood. To break the connection between Mercy and her brother, they cut out the heart and burned it. Some reports say the ashes were mixed with water and given to Edwin as medicine. From a modern perspective, the scene at Chestnut Hill looks like a small town acting out a folk horror script. It is tempting to file it away as a bizarre local superstition. Yet the decision that brought George Brown to his daughter's grave did not come from nowhere, and it did not happen only once. The Brown case is simply the best documented episode in a broader pattern of exhumations, heart-burnings, and graveside rituals scattered across rural New England in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Historians now refer to that pattern as the New England vampire panic. The term is modern. People at the time rarely used the word vampire for themselves. Some newspaper writers did, drawing on European headlines and popular novels, but many local accounts spoke instead of consumption, wasting, and sucking as metaphors. Families did not imagine elegant aristocrats in capes. They worried that a specific dead relative might be drawing life from the living in a much more literal sense, that the dead person's condition in the grave was somehow tied to the family's ongoing illness. This investigation follows the thread behind that worry. It asks a question that reaches beyond the Brown family, beyond Rhode Island, and beyond the 19th century. When medicine fails, how do communities explain patterns of suffering they cannot control? And in the New England case in particular, how did love for the living turn, step by step, into ritual violence directed at the dead? The usual way to tell the Mercy Brown story is to isolate it. A single episode in a single village, an oddity, a headline. That approach keeps the horror safely contained. It also obscures the decisions that made the exhumation possible in the first place. To understand those decisions, we have to break that isolation. We have to set Mercy's case back into the wider landscape of disease, belief, and daily life, to understand the world in which that remedy made sense. That world is smaller than New England as a whole. The exhumations cluster in particular states and towns, often in places that look, at first glance, unremarkable. Farming communities in Rhode Island and Connecticut, hill towns in Vermont, scattered settlements in rural Massachusetts. Many of them were modest in size. Exeter's population hovered in the low hundreds. Most people knew one another by name, families intertwined through marriage and shared work. News traveled along church pews, fence lines, and general store counters far more quickly than official reports ever could. The landscape itself shaped experience. Farmhouses sat apart from each other, linked by unpaved roads that were difficult to travel in winter and muddy in spring. Physicians served wide territories and could not always visit as often as families wished. When illness settled in a house, the burden fell primarily on the household. Neighbors helped as they could, but the daily work of care remained inside the family. That gave sickness a very specific geography. It came to feel attached to certain rooms, certain beds, and certain surnames. Religion framed how many New Englanders thought about illness and the dead. The dominant churches in these towns taught that the body would rise again at the Last Judgment. Graves were meant to remain closed until that day. To disturb a burial without compelling reason came close to desecration. Ministers preached about the hope of resurrection, the importance of a good death, and the comfort of knowing a loved one rested undisturbed in consecrated ground. Funeral sermons, which were often printed or copied by hand, emphasized patience and trust in providence, even when the reasons for suffering were unclear. At the same time, folk practices around death persisted alongside formal doctrine. Families kept locks of hair, death portraits, and mourning jewelry. They visited graves on anniversaries, tended headstones, and read meaning into small details. A sudden storm during a burial, a coffin that seemed unusually heavy, a body that looked peaceful or disturbed. None of these observations contradicted official teaching, but they added layers of interpretation. The cemetery was both a sacred place of rest and a site where the living watched the dead for hints about the state of their souls. These overlapping understandings made exhumation emotionally charged. Opening a grave risked more than physical disturbance. It raised questions about respect, faith, and the dead person's spiritual condition. That is part of why these rituals required consensus. A father who agreed to open his daughter's grave had to weigh his duty to protect the living against his duty to honor the dead. Neighbors who urged him on had to believe that the threat to the living was severe enough to justify the act. Clergy and doctors who consented, or at least did not intervene, had to decide that allowing the ritual did less harm than refusing it. Exhumations happened rarely, not because the idea never occurred to people, but because the barrier against disturbing the dead was high. Against this background, consumption was not an abstract medical category. It was a familiar presence. By the 19th century, tuberculosis was a leading cause of death in New England. Parish registers and town records show its footprint clearly. Entries for consumption appear again and again beside names of young adults and middle-aged parents. In some years, the disease accounted for a quarter or more of recorded deaths in a given community. Most people did not need statistics to grasp this. They saw it on the faces of their relatives. Doctors recognized it by its sequence: the stubborn cough that did not fade, the gradual loss of weight, the fever that burned low and steady, the flushed cheeks and bright eyes that gave patients a deceptive air of animation, the blood that began to appear in handkerchiefs, the dwindling strength. Families saw all of this at closer range. They watched favorite chairs go unused, tools hang untouched, daily tasks reassigned as the sick person could no longer perform them. The illness moved slowly enough that everyone had time to dread where it was heading. The disease also moved in ways that made it feel personal. Because tuberculosis spread through the air, households with one sick member were likely to see others fall ill in turn. Before germ theory, that pattern did not look like a chain of infection. It looked like a chain of fate. In some families, death followed the same line: mother, daughter, son, perhaps an aunt living in the same house, all within years of each other, while cousins across town remained untouched. Sickness took on the shape of a story, with certain surnames as its recurring cast. There was another cruel twist. Tuberculosis rarely followed a straight descent. Patients often improved briefly. A fever broke, appetite returned, energy lifted, and the family dared to hope that the worst had passed. Sometimes this happened more than once. Each improvement strengthened the sense that recovery was possible, that the person could be pulled back from the edge. When the illness surged again and finally killed, it felt less like a sudden blow and more like a long tug of war that ended with the sick person on the wrong side of an invisible line. That line between here and gone mattered for belief. In communities where sudden accidents, epidemics, and childbirth deaths already crowded the graveyards, consumption was distinctive. It hung around. It left images behind. A face that looked oddly alive in the coffin. A body that, when buried in cold ground, might not decompose quickly. People who had attended funerals for those lost to other causes noticed the difference. The gap between burial and decay seemed wider with consumption victims, especially in winter. That gap is where the vampire explanations would later take root. From the standpoint of modern medicine, the conditions needed for this pattern are clear. An airborne bacterial disease, cold climate delaying decomposition, limited diagnostic tools, no antibiotics. In the rural New England of the late 18th and 19th centuries, those conditions converged. But the people who lived through it did not stand outside their own experience. They did not see microorganisms or delayed putrefaction. They saw relatives who grew thinner, coughed blood, lingered for months or years, died, and were followed into the grave by others from the same house. To understand why exhumations like Mercy Brown's felt like a possible cure, we have to stay inside that experience. We have to look at the medical reality that killed these families, but also the cultural reality that explained why they died. Neither answer alone is enough. The bacteria did not write the stories. The stories did not conjure the bacteria. The panic emerged in the space where those two realities met. That culture was built on ideas about death, the soul, and the body that came from Europe, scripture, local custom, and personal grief. Ministers preached about resurrection and judgment. Families shared stories about restless spirits, ill omens, and the importance of a proper burial. Folklore about harmful dead, revenants who troubled the living, had circulated in parts of Europe for centuries before reaching American soil. Printed accounts of vampire scares in Eastern Europe appeared in English-language newspapers as early as the 18th century. New England readers were not entirely unfamiliar with these reports. At the same time, the word vampire did not have a single fixed meaning. In the early 18th century European reports, it often referred to villagers who believed a dead person was attacking them at night and killing neighbors by degrees. The bodies of suspected vampires were exhumed. Officials described them as unnervingly well preserved, ruddy complexions, flexible limbs, fresh-looking blood. Rituals followed: staking, decapitation, burning. Later, Gothic fiction transformed that figure into a more stylized monster, and eventually into the urbane, romantic vampire of popular culture. The New England cases sit somewhere in between. They share elements with earlier European reports, most notably the idea that a specific dead person can harm the living, and that exhuming and burning the heart can break the connection. But they occur in a different setting, under different religious and social conditions, and in response to a different disease pattern. They also take place later in time, in a period when newspapers and doctors documented them in ways earlier village panics rarely were. This investigation does not treat the New England vampire panic as a simple echo of Europe, nor as a completely independent invention. Instead, it follows the connections and the gaps. Where did New Englanders learn about vampires, and what did that word suggest to them? How did they adapt older European patterns to their own circumstances? Where did they diverge, and why? Most importantly, where can we see the limits of the vampire label, the places where it obscures more than it reveals? Newspapers played a quiet but crucial role in shaping how these events were understood. Rural families often subscribed to at least one weekly paper that carried national and international stories, along with local notices. When an exhumation occurred, it sometimes appeared in a short column, a few lines noting that a body had been dug up and a heart burned in an effort to stop consumption in a certain family. Details varied from report to report. Some writers adopted a mocking tone, treating the ritual as evidence of backward superstition. Others described it more neutrally, as one among many local responses to illness. The reach of these articles meant that a ritual tested in one town could become known in another without personal contact between the families involved. Even when newspapers did not mention the word vampire, the language they used carried specific associations. Descriptions of bodies that looked fresh or plump, of hearts filled with black blood, of corpses that seemed unnaturally preserved, echoed earlier European accounts that readers might have encountered in reprinted stories from overseas. In a few cases, editors explicitly linked New England exhumations to the vampire scares of Eastern Europe, inviting readers to see their own neighbors as acting out an old world drama. Families at the center of these stories rarely used such language for themselves, but they could not entirely ignore how the wider world labeled their choices. Beyond Mercy Brown, the documentary record preserves glimpses of other families who reached for the same remedy. In one Connecticut town, relatives opened the graves of several siblings in succession, each time hoping to find and neutralize the one whose condition in death might explain the other's decline. In Vermont, a father allowed his son's body to be exhumed and the vital organs burned after watching multiple children die of consumption. These episodes did not attract the same lasting attention as Mercy's case, but they followed similar patterns: clustered deaths, limited medical options, community pressure, and a final, difficult consent to disturb the dead. To answer those questions, we will move through several layers. First, we will step more fully into the world of tuberculosis itself, the sick rooms, the household routines, the ways families talked about the disease. Then we will listen to how communities described suspected cases of the hungry dead in letters, newspapers, sermons, and local recollections. From there, we will trace the earlier European traditions that supplied some of the language and ritual. Finally, we will watch how the entire structure begins to collapse as germ theory takes hold and medical explanations replace older cures. Even within the medical profession, understanding of tuberculosis during the vampire panic period was uneven. By the 1830s, some physicians had come to see phthisis and related wasting illnesses as part of a single disease process, but the exact cause remained contested. Was it hereditary weakness, miasma in the air, imbalances in the body's humors, or something else entirely? When Robert Koch announced the discovery of the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, the news did not instantly reshape practice in rural New England. It filtered slowly through medical journals and city hospitals before reaching country doctors who still relied on long experience, case notes, and treatments that offered comfort more than cure. In that lag between new theory and local practice, families continued to see the disease in older terms, as a wasting force that moved mysteriously through households, striking one relative after another, while physicians could offer little more than observation and palliative care. The journey begins with Mercy Brown, because her case gathers many of these strands in one place. She dies of consumption in a small Rhode Island community that has already buried several of her relatives. Her father is urged to consent to an exhumation. The examination of her body produces exactly the signs neighbors expect. a heart that still contains blood, a body that seems more intact than it should be. A ritual burning follows. Journalists write about it. Years later, historians and folklorists single it out as the emblematic episode of the New England vampire panic. Mercy's case will return repeatedly, but it cannot carry the whole narrative by itself. It is, in many ways, an outlier, unusually well documented, unusually late in the timeline, and unusually visible in print. Other cases survive only as fragments, a note in a parish register, a brief mention in a doctor's notebook, a single paragraph in a newspaper column, a recollection written down decades later. This series will bring those fragments together. The goal is not to inflate them into a vast, coordinated movement. It is to map the smaller, scattered decisions that people like George Brown made under pressure. Those decisions share several features. They usually occur after multiple deaths in the same family. They involve a kind of last resort, reached after other remedies have failed. They draw on local consensus. A few voices in the community argue for the exhumation and the burning. Others hesitate. A physician may object or may agree to supervise in order to keep the procedure controlled. Clergy may warn against such acts, or they may stand by quietly. The family at the center must agree. Without that consent, the grave stays shut. This mixture of desperation and deliberation matters. It complicates any attempt to dismiss the panic as mere superstition. The people involved are not characters in a folktale. They are farmers, laborers, clergy, and doctors trying to protect the living with the tools and ideas available to them. They operate in communities where scripture is read weekly, where newspapers arrive with reports from abroad, where medicine is slowly professionalizing but has not yet caught up with the diseases it faces. The exhumations arise at the intersection of those forces. To follow those forces, we have to look at the panic from the inside out. We have to look at tuberculosis as it actually functioned, how it spread and which bodies it claimed. We have to map the timing and location of the exhumations. We have to examine the stories people told using words like consumption and vampire. And we must consider how grief, fear, and responsibility shape decisions in a house where children were dying and no cure seemed to work. None of these factors works in isolation. Medicine can explain why Mercy's body appeared preserved in March, but not why burning her heart felt like justice. Folklore can trace the path of vampire stories from Eastern Europe, but not why they resonated in some families more than others. Psychology can help us understand the guilt that drove the action, but not why specific ritual forms took hold. Only by overlapping these views can we come close to understanding the panic in full. Geography mattered too. New England is a broad label, but the vampire panic did not affect the region evenly. Rhode Island produced several of the most cited cases, including Mercy Brown. Connecticut and Vermont contributed others. Coastal towns, inland hill communities, and border regions between states all provide examples. Some of these areas had higher rates of tuberculosis. Some had closer ties to older European folk belief. Some had particular religious cultures that shaped interpretations of the dead. As we move through the series, we will see how place matters. Time also played a role. The panic did not appear out of nowhere in 1892 and vanish when Mercy's grave was closed. It has a rise, a period of activity, and a decline. Early cases in the late 18th century look slightly different from later ones. They occur in a world where medical knowledge is less organized, print culture is less dense, and older belief systems sit closer to the surface. By the mid-19th century, the vocabulary of medicine has expanded. Newspapers spread reports more quickly, and debates over superstition versus science grow sharper. Watching how the exhumations change across these decades will tell us as much about the birth of modern skepticism as about the persistence of older fears. All of this returns us to the hill in Exeter. When George Brown gave permission to open his daughter's grave, he was not acting in isolation. He was stepping into a pattern, a way of thinking about disease and the dead that had been taking shape for over a century in the region around him. He knew neighbors who had lost children to consumption. He had heard about other graves opened in other towns. He had listened to conflicting voices, some insisting that such measures were wrong, others claiming that, without them, his remaining child would surely die. Mercy's exhumation is therefore both a beginning and an end. It sits at the end of a long line of unwritten stories, smaller, less documented rituals in hamlets and farmsteads across New England. At the same time, it has become the beginning point for most modern accounts of the vampire panic, the place where researchers start because the sources are richest. This investigation will use her case for both purposes. It will treat it as a doorway into a wider history and as a final flare of a belief system about to be overtaken by new medical explanations. The chapters that follow will move backward from that March morning and outward from Exeter. They will step inside sick rooms where the White Death drew out its long battles. They will read the letters, sermons, and news stories that tried to make sense of those battles. They will cross the Atlantic to earlier vampire scares, then return again to New England cemeteries. Along the way, we will keep sight of the central question: how a community's care for its living, joined with fear and limited knowledge, can lead to the decision to cut open a child's grave. But one point should already be clear. The New England vampire panic was not a cartoon of ignorant villagers desecrating graves for sport. It was a series of careful, contested, and often heartbreaking decisions made in the shadow of a disease that medicine could not cure. Mercy Brown stands in that shadow, along with the many other names that never made their way into headlines. To understand them, we have to follow the illness that filled their homes long before anyone reached for a shovel. In most New England homes that faced consumption, the disease arrived quietly. It began with a cough that seemed ordinary for the season, an irritation from wood smoke, a lingering cold, the price of breathing cold air while bringing in firewood or walking to church. The first weeks left room for denial. People had work to do. Livestock needed tending, bread needed baking, children needed clothing patched yet again. A cough was an inconvenience folded into the noise of an already hard life. The change came when the cough refused to leave. In the Brown household and in dozens like it, the cough kept returning at night. It shook the bed frame, woke the family, and left the patient sitting upright, trying to draw breath while the rest of the house listened in the dark. At first, those nights existed alongside normal ones. Then the balance tipped. Nights of uninterrupted sleep became rare, then exceptional. The household rhythm bent around the illness. Meals shifted, chores redistributed, visits shortened or stopped altogether. Over months, the disease wrote itself into the body in ways no one could miss. Appetite slipped away, weight fell off the frame, clothes that once fit snugly hung loose, faces hollowed, yet at the same time, a strange flush crept into the cheeks, the famous hectic color that visitors remarked on with unease. Eyes grew large against thinning faces, giving patients a brightness that looked, to some observers, almost beautiful. In cities, writers and artists later turned that look into an aesthetic, wrapping it in myths about sensitive souls and heightened feeling. In rural New England, where the patient was your wife, your brother, or your child, that look was an alarm. The cough changed too. It deepened. It rattled. At a certain point, it began to leave marks. Specks of red appeared in the handkerchief, then streaks, then more. Families knew what that meant long before most of them heard the word bacillus. Blood on the cloth meant the disease had taken hold in a way that rarely reversed. Some would use phrases like, "the lungs broke," or "the chest opened." The technical term was hemoptysis. The household term was a sign that the end was coming. What made tuberculosis such a powerful force in the emotional life of these communities was its pace. Sudden death, accident, stroke, violent injury brought shock and immediate chaos. Consumption did something different. It set up residence. It invited itself into every room for months or years at a time. Families watched the same pattern unfold in slow motion: a cough, then weakness, then retreat from work, then confinement to bed. There was time to argue, time to hope, time to try remedies, time to bargain with God. There was also time to watch fear grow. It rarely came alone. In parish registers and family Bibles, the disease appears as a pattern of names grouped together by a few short years. One sibling after another, sometimes a parent, sometimes an aunt, living under the same roof. The disease favored close quarters and repeated contact. In practice, that meant it favored households. A single case in a town might be tragic. 3 deaths in one family within a decade began to look, to those inside the house, like something more than chance. For the people trying to live through it, there were only so many places to locate blame. Some pointed inward. They spoke of weak lungs that ran in the family line, of constitutions never suited to this climate. Others looked outward, toward weather, dampness, or bad air. Doctors talked about predisposition and irritation of the lungs, about the dangers of crowding and poor ventilation. They could name patterns. They could rarely change them. Unlike cholera or smallpox, consumption often spared the very young and the old, while striking those in the middle decades of life. Young adults, newly married couples, parents of small children. These were the ones whose names filled the consumption columns in New England records. The disease waited until a person had become necessary to others, until households and communities leaned on their labor and their presence. Then it began hollowing them out. That age pattern made the illness feel like something targeted. It seemed to choose the people whose loss would hurt the most. Inside the house, the disease reorganized space. Rooms not designed as sick rooms became exactly that. A bed might be moved closer to a window for air, or nearer to the stove for warmth. Chairs appeared at odd angles, placed to watch over the patient at night. Dishes and utensils might be set aside for the sick one, even if no one could explain precisely what difference that made. Children learned to tread more quietly near certain doors. Conversations lowered their volume when the coughing started again on the other side of the wall. As the illness advanced, the patient's world shrank. Trips outside became rare, then impossible. Church, market, and social calls fell away. The rhythm of life narrowed to the space between bed, chamber pot, and stove. For those still healthy, the world shrank too, though in a different way. Someone had to stay behind to tend the sick. Someone had to carry water, change linens, clean the basin, sit up during the worst nights. Weeks of this, then months, pressed on people in ways that don't appear in death statistics, but shape decisions just as powerfully. Because consumption stretched over time, households lived in an in-between state. The sick person was present, speaking, eating a little, perhaps even laughing on good days, yet always already moving toward death. This liminal condition invited all kinds of interpretation. Some saw the disease as a trial sent by God, a spur to patience and spiritual reflection. Others saw it as a family curse. Some began to speak in terms of drains and burdens, not because they lacked affection, but because the next winter was coming. The harvest needed to be brought in, and younger children needed food. Medicine, in theory, should have provided a way through this. By the late 19th century, European laboratories had begun to map the disease onto glass slides and microscopes. In 1882, Robert Koch announced the discovery of the tubercle bacillus. In principle, the cause of consumption was no longer wholly mysterious. In practice, news from Berlin did little for a farmer in Rhode Island or a stonecutter in Vermont. Diagnosis without treatment was cold comfort. Even in towns where a doctor had heard of Koch's work, the advice to patients still boiled down to rest, good air, fresh milk, and hope. The gulf between what medical science could say in theory and what it could do in practice left a wide space for other explanations to operate. Doctors could tell families that the disease moved from lung to lung through shared air, but they could not offer a medicine that stopped it. They could warn against crowded rooms, yet few households had the luxury of spare, well-ventilated space. They could recommend change of climate, which for most rural families translated into a polite way of saying, "You will die here." In that vacuum, older ways of thinking about sickness continued to work. People who had grown up hearing about wasting illnesses and stories of something stealing vitality in the night had no reason to abandon those categories when faced with a disease whose daily effects looked exactly like that. They watched a healthy family member become thin, pale, and exhausted, while someone already buried seemed to hold their place in the household. For minds trained on both scripture and local story, it was easy to imagine some tie still running between the grave and the bed. The word consumption itself carried that idea. It suggested being eaten from within, worn away by something unseen but persistent. Rural families did not have to reach for elaborate metaphors. They watched the process take place in front of them. A daughter who had once carried heavy pails from the well could, months later, barely lift a cup. A son who worked fields from sunrise to sunset lay shivering under quilts. Weight, color, strength, and finally breath were taken in slow sequence, as if something fed on them. Numbers gave the disease another kind of power. In some New England towns during the 19th century, tuberculosis was responsible for a large share of all recorded deaths. In practice, that meant almost every household knew someone claimed by it. People could list cousins, neighbors, fellow parishioners, all lost to the same cough. When a new case appeared in a family already touched by it, no one needed charts to understand what might follow. The disease had already carved a path through their social circle. It simply returned to walk it again. This created an atmosphere where every cough and weight loss in a household with a recent burial felt like more than coincidence. If a mother had died of consumption and, within a year, her son began to show similar signs, the resemblance felt pointed. The fact that entire families sometimes died in sequence made each surviving member wonder who would be next. The disease did not just erode lungs, it eroded the sense of safety that came from family life. The home was supposed to be the place where you escaped outside dangers. Here, the danger could sit at your table. People took steps that balanced care and fear. They might open windows more often, even in winter, convinced that bad air trapped inside made things worse. They might insist that visitors stand in doorways rather than enter the sick room. In some cases, they limited direct contact, especially with children. But the same family members who spoke warily about contagion also sat on the edge of the bed, wiped sweat from a brow, and lifted a weakened body into a more comfortable position. The instinct to protect the healthy and the instinct to comfort the sick occupied the same set of hands. This conflict took on a special intensity when someone lingered for years. A patient who declined rapidly elicited grief and shock. A patient who endured several cycles of improvement and relapse created a different kind of pressure. Each recovery raised hope that this time the corner had been turned. Each relapse undercut that hope, leaving everyone more tired than before. Over time, some relatives began to speak in practical terms. Who would keep the farm running if 2 more winters passed like this? What would happen to younger children if the last working adult fell ill? The social dimension extended beyond kin. A village or hamlet absorbed the weight of many such households. When several families fought consumption at once, the community heard coughing from multiple houses, saw multiple funeral processions, and watched certain pews empty out. The disease wore down informal support systems. Women who had once gone from house to help new mothers now spent their time nursing the sick. Men who had once lent teams or tools for heavy jobs found themselves digging more graves than fields. The constant presence of the disease left people feeling hunted. In that setting, stories that hinted at some deliberate agency behind the illness had an obvious appeal. If disease arrived through miasma, chance, or invisible organisms too small to see, there was little a community could do but endure. If, however, sickness followed a pattern that connected living sufferers to one particular grave, then a specific act, opening that grave, dealing with that body, offered a way to intervene. The idea that someone already dead could be exerting a harmful pull on the living gave shape to fear and pointed it at a visible target. This way of thinking did not spring from fantasy alone. Across Europe and elsewhere, communities had, for centuries, treated certain kinds of death as suspect, sudden, violent, or incomplete. Those dead required special handling. Bodies that failed to decay properly often sat at the center of stories about restless spirits. New Englanders inherited both written theology and unwritten law about such matters. In the daily life of a town, those threads intertwined. A minister could preach about resurrection and eternal rest, while, a day later, parishioners whispered to each other about the way a certain corpse had looked at the wake. When consumption entered that mental landscape, it slotted into existing channels. Here was a disease that left bodies pale but seemingly intact for an unsettlingly long time, especially when cold earth slowed decay. Here were families whose members died in sequence, with the first burial in the line sitting in the cemetery like an accusation. The language people used, speaking of someone drawing off life, or of the sick being pulled down by the dead, suggested an invisible transfer of vitality. Without microscopes or germ cultures to interrupt that image, it made sense. Doctors' visits did not always dispel that sense. A country physician might arrive by horse at the Brown farm carrying a black bag and a head full of new theories, but he worked inside the same emotional atmosphere as his patients. He could count pulses, listen with his ear pressed to a chest, and notice night sweats and weight loss as clinical signs. He could label them as phthisis or pulmonary tuberculosis. But when he left, the family still faced months of care and the possibility of yet another funeral. His language might have been different. The inexorable sequence remained the same. Because medical professionals often lacked tools to change outcomes, their authority was partial. People respected their training but also measured results. When advice about fresh air, tonics, and rest failed over and over, other voices that offered more directed remedies gained weight. Neighbors remembered stories from earlier generations, a time when someone, convinced that a dead relative was draining a surviving child, opened the grave and found a body that looked too whole, too red, too full of blood. They remembered that, after a ritual act was performed, the illness in the house seemed to break. In printed statistics, there is no line item that reads, desperation. In the lived reality of these communities, it was everywhere. It appeared in the way people talked at the margins of church gatherings, in the extra candles burned at night, in the decision to consult someone known for having knowledge beyond ordinary medicine. For a father with one surviving child wasting away in bed, The choice was not between science and superstition in abstract. It was between standing at that bedside, watching the same pattern repeat, or taking the one remaining action that people around him swore had helped others. Tuberculosis also changed the way time felt. Days stretched under the weight of chores and care. Months vanished under the erosion of one body after another. Seasons marked stages of the illness. The winter when the cough began, the spring when the blood appeared, the summer when strength never quite returned. After a death, the household recalibrated, only to begin the cycle again with another member. Grief itself became layered. People mourned freshly lost relatives while still adjusting to earlier absences. Under those conditions, talk of lingering ties between the living and dead took on a heavy charge. Observers watching consumption move through a town tried to make sense of who lived and who died. A robust farmer might collapse while a frailer sibling endured. A dutiful daughter might fade while a more reckless brother recovered. In the absence of a clear cause, people slid toward moral explanations. Perhaps hard work, worry, or some hidden fault had tipped the balance. That same habit of reading meaning into patterns did not stop at the grave. The men who eventually lifted shovels in a cemetery were not strangers to death. They had carried coffins, stood beside open caskets, watched faces slacken and skin sink back. They had also heard stories of exceptions, a body that seemed too well preserved, nails that looked longer, hair that appeared thicker than memory allowed. Without modern accounts of post-mortem change, those impressions lodged in the mind, as evidence that some bodies completed their journey out of the living world, and others somehow stalled along the way. Tuberculosis created the perfect interval for those thoughts to grow. Months after a burial, a house still felt arranged around someone who was gone. A chair left unused, tools hanging on a familiar nail, a shawl folded on a shelf. If, in that same period, another relative began to cough through the night in a recognizably similar way, the household lived with two focal points at once: the grave on the hill and the bed by the stove. Linking them did not require a leap into fantasy. It required only the sense that a story had not finished, that something about the earlier death remained unfinished. The fear that consumption produced was layered. On the surface lay the immediate terror of suffocation and slow physical failure. Beneath that came anxiety about what illness did to relationships. Family members who once brought comfort now carried risk. Shared beds and bowls became suspect. Embraces felt dangerous. Deeper still ran the dread that burial did not close the account, that the connection between the dead and the living might continue in a way measured in lost sleep and freshly filled graves. Under those conditions, the disease took on a particular shape in the imagination. It moved slowly and intimately, returning again and again to the same surnames in town registers. It traveled through shared air in cramped rooms, yet left no visible external agent to blame. Families watched each stage play out, comparing the newest cough to the last one they had nursed. In a culture where older talk about malign influences, unsettled dead, and broken funerary norms still circulated, this pattern almost invited explanations that reached beyond what eyes could see. When communities across New England began opening graves and examining hearts, they were responding to that shape. From inside the sick room, the act at the cemetery looked less like a wild jump from cough to corpse, and more like a final extension of care. For relatives who had already rearranged their lives around months of nursing, the grave became the one place where love for the living could still be expressed as decisive action. The ritual at the grave was the last narrow path that seemed to offer any control in a world where the disease had already taken more than any minister, doctor, or ledger could repair. On a February morning in 1793, the people of Manchester, Vermont, walked to the edge of town and gathered around a forge. A blacksmith had banked his fire higher than usual, the coals pushed into a white-orange core. In front of the shop stood a coffin, already opened, its boards pulled back. Inside lay the remains of Rachel Harris Burton, dead from consumption 3 years prior. Her widower, Captain Isaac Burton, had remarried quickly. When his new wife began to cough and fade in the same drawn-out way, neighbors revived an old suggestion. The first wife might still be feeding on the living. The crowd that formed that day was not small. Local accounts speak of hundreds of onlookers, perhaps as many as 1,000, drawn from the town and surrounding countryside. Word had gone out that something unusual would happen. Rachel's liver, heart, and lungs were removed and carried to the blacksmith's forge. As people watched, the organs were burned down to ash. Burton's second wife later recovered, and the story stayed in local memory as an instance where a desperate cure appeared to work. That single event already contains most of the elements that will repeat across New England for the next century. A family struck by a wasting illness, a trail of deaths that moves from spouse to spouse or parent to child, a community meeting where someone proposes that the dead might still be connected to the living. Then, a public ritual at the grave or at a forge, the opening of the coffin, the examination of the body, the removal and burning of organs. The result, a hoped-for break in the chain of deaths, turns into a story that neighbors tell for years afterward. Even taken on its own, that forge-side burning shows how a grave remedy grows out of repetition rather than impulse. People watched one illness rhyme with another, the same cough, the same thinning frame, the same walk to the cemetery, and began to feel as though all those lines converged on a single coffin. By the time someone voiced the idea of opening Rachel's grave, the town had already rehearsed the story in their heads. If every path of suffering seems to run through one body in the ground, perhaps changing that body is the only way to bend the story for the living. Manchester is worth dwelling on because it provides our first fully recorded example. It shows that these were not furtive acts carried out in secret, with a few frightened relatives huddled around a grave at midnight. The ritual unfolded in daylight, in front of a crowd, using the most practical technology at hand, a blacksmith's fire, hot enough to reduce organs to ash. The act carried social legitimacy. The blacksmith, the captain, the neighbors who attended, they all lent their presence as a kind of approval. The details also signal how communities blended older folk ideas with the tools of their everyday world. There is no coffin wrenched open by a mob and a heart chewed by villagers, as later sensational retellings might suggest. Instead, a forge that usually shaped iron for wagon rims and tools becomes a place of medical experiment. If fire could temper metal, perhaps it could also break whatever unseen thread connected Rachel to the living. Stories like this do not survive by accident. They survive because people retell them when new crises arise. When tuberculosis returned to Manchester or surrounding towns, the example of Rachel Harris and the blacksmith's fire lay close at hand. Her case became a precedent, proof that the dead might still influence the living and that decisive action could interrupt the pattern. As consumption spread through rural Rhode Island and Vermont in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, similar stories appeared in town histories and local reminiscences. One of the best known involves Stukely and Honor Tillinghast of Exeter, Rhode Island. Several of their children died in succession from a wasting illness. Honor began to complain that she felt the presence of her dead daughter Sarah at night, a visitation she believed weakened her further. Neighbors urged Stukely to consider that the first child to die might be drawing life from the rest. Accounts differ on exactly how many graves were opened, but they agree that the family eventually exhumed at least some of the children and that vital organs were destroyed. Whether every detail in these retrospective narratives can be trusted is less important than the pattern they reveal. Families rarely reached for exhumation after a single death. The ritual appeared after a sequence: one child, then another, then perhaps a spouse or sibling, all falling ill with the same mix of cough, weight loss, night sweats, and blood. Only when the disease began to feel like an invisible predator moving systematically through the household did the idea of the returning dead become persuasive. The Tillinghast story also shows how perception of visitation could support that belief. Honors reports of Sarah appearing at night are exactly the kind of experience that often accompanies grief. Sensed presences, dreams so vivid that they feel like waking encounters, the weight of someone sitting on the bed. In a community already primed by older European revenant tales, such experiences could be woven into an explanation. The dead child had not simply gone, she was coming back to pull another member of the family toward the grave. Rhode Island produced other cases that never rose to Mercy Brown's level of fame, but were recorded in local histories. In Foster, a woman named Nancy Young was exhumed after multiple relatives died. In her case, the ritual was even more visceral. Her entire body was burned not just to destroy it, but so the sick relatives could stand in the smoke and inhale the fumes as a cure. In another case from Peacedale around the 1870s, William Rose reportedly dug up the body of his own daughter and burned her heart when several children in the household succumbed to consumption. These stories often come down to us through a mixture of newspaper clippings, town histories, and descendants' memories. That layering introduces uncertainty, dates may blur, and the exact order of events can shift. Yet the core actions recur with such consistency that they begin to look like a regional ritual system rather than isolated eccentricities. Graves are opened, hearts, lungs, or livers are removed. Fire is applied, the living hope for a break in the pattern of deaths. Importantly, these actions did not mark their practitioners as outcasts. In many of the surviving accounts, the families involved are described in sympathetic or neutral terms. They are ordinary farmers, sometimes devout church members, often described as respectable. Local writers may later call the belief superstition, especially as germ theory spreads, but they rarely depict the families as fools or villains. Instead, the emphasis falls on desperation. People facing an illness that emptied entire households, trying the one remedy local tradition offered when official medicine failed. By this point in the record, a clear outline emerges. Each episode centers on a family council deciding that harm directed toward a body already in the earth might still count as protection for the bodies in their beds. The same sequence repeats. Watch a loved one die. Watch the pattern begin again in another chest. Weigh the horror of disturbing the grave against the horror of doing nothing. That is the pivot this investigation keeps returning to, the moment when love for the living quietly redraws what kindness to the dead can include. If family stories carried these rituals forward across generations, newspapers made them visible across county lines. In May 1854, a Connecticut paper, the Norwich Courier, reported on an incident in Jewett City, a village within the town of Griswold. The Ray family had been losing members to consumption for nearly a decade. First, a son in his 20s died, then the father, then another adult son. By the time a fourth son sickened, relatives concluded that one of the buried men might be feeding on the rest. They exhumed the bodies and burned them near the graveyard. The newspaper did not coin the phrase Jewett City vampires at the time. That label would come later, but it treated the event as a curiosity worthy of commentary. Writers framed the ritual as a throwback to an earlier age, an old belief lingering in an otherwise modern landscape. Still, the article reads less like an exposé of depravity and more like a distant observer shaking his head at the persistence of folk medicine. The Ray family's actions are strange, even troubling, yet recognizably part of the human effort to make sense of an invisible killer. The Ray case matters because it sits at the intersection of local oral tradition and wider public discourse. Within Jewett City, the decision to exhume probably followed conversations among kin and neighbors, using the same explanatory framework seen in Vermont and Rhode Island. If the dead continue to draw on the living, cutting the connection might save those who remain. Once the story entered the newspaper, however, it joined a broader conversation about ignorance, rural life, and the boundary between acceptable folk practice and unacceptable superstition. Scholars tracing the pattern have suggested that publicity around Jewett City may have influenced nearby communities. When archaeologists in the 1990s excavated an odd grave in a former family cemetery a few miles from the Ray plot, an exhumed skeleton rearranged in a skull and crossbones pose, they connected it to this same cluster of beliefs. The grave belonged to a farmer, likely John Barber, whose family had also suffered from consumption. His body showed evidence of exhumation years after initial burial. The chest was broken open, and the bones were reassembled in a way consistent with cutting out the heart. This archaeological case, often referred to simply by the coffin's nailhead initials, JB55, shows how the vampire panic left marks that can still be read in the ground. Unlike newspaper coverage, which inevitably frames events through the writer's perspective, the grave offers direct physical evidence of what someone actually did. The rearranged bones and the signs of disease on the skeleton point to a very specific interpretation. Relatives exhumed JB's body, opened the chest to remove organs, then reburied him in a way intended to prevent further harm to the living. What makes JB55 particularly valuable is the combination of forensic analysis and documentary context. Medical examination of the bones revealed lesions and changes consistent with long-term tuberculosis. Nearby graves in the same small cemetery also showed evidence of the disease. The archaeological record therefore mirrors the pattern described in written accounts: a cluster of consumption deaths, a household on edge, and a last, dramatic attempt to halt the sequence by targeting the body thought to anchor the misfortune. Vermont yields another case that complicates any easy association between such rituals and ignorance. In 1817, 20-year-old Frederick Ransom died of tuberculosis in South Woodstock. Frederick was not a marginal figure. He attended Dartmouth College and came from a relatively well-to-do family. Yet when more relatives showed signs of the same illness, his father ordered the body exhumed and the heart burned on a blacksmith's forge. Contemporary reports emphasize how unusual it seemed that a family of their education and standing resorted to this cure. Frederick's case demonstrates that the belief system driving these rituals could persist even in households that were otherwise deeply engaged with the institutions of their day. Wealth, literacy, or access to physicians did not automatically erase older explanations. Instead, folk and formal knowledge coexisted, sometimes uneasily. A family might consult doctors, follow prescribed regimens of rest and diet, and still keep the older remedy in reserve. When a second or third family member died, despite respectable treatment, the balance could shift. The grave ritual offered something official medicine could not: the perception of taking decisive action that matched the pattern of deaths everyone could see. Around the same time, Henry David Thoreau recorded in his journal a case from Vermont in which townspeople burned the lungs, heart, and liver of a recently deceased consumption victim to try to prevent further deaths. Thoreau, writing as an observer already steeped in scientific thinking, saw this as evidence that a more savage layer of belief persisted beneath the surface of American life. His phrasing reveals his own biases, yet it also confirms that these rituals were widely enough known to make their way into private reflections of educated New Englanders. Taken together, these examples, Rachel Harris in Manchester, the Tillinghast children in Exeter, Nancy Young and William Rose's daughter, the Ray family of Jewett City, JB55 in Griswold, Frederick Ransom in South Woodstock, allow us to reconstruct the internal logic of the grave remedy. Each case is unique in its family details, yet when viewed side by side, they fall into a remarkably stable pattern. The pattern almost always begins with a household where consumption has taken hold. A first victim, often a spouse or adult child, dies after a long decline. Physical space within the home makes that decline highly visible. A bed in the main room, a hacking cough heard at all hours, blood on handkerchiefs or bedding. The corpse is buried in the family plot or local cemetery. For a time, life continues. Then a second relative begins to show the same symptoms. The resemblance between the two illnesses encourages people to think in terms of connection. In an era before microscopic pathogens, connection often meant some kind of ongoing tie between the dead and the living. A third illness in the same household intensifies that impression. The disease looks sequential, almost purposeful, moving from one body to another. At this point, suspicion may settle on the first to die, the person whose body has been in the ground longest. Stories from Rhode Island and Vermont suggest that dreams and waking visions often played a role. Surviving relatives describe feeling the presence of the dead at night or dreaming of them sitting on the chest, a sensation common in sleep paralysis. Those experiences, filtered through a worldview in which the dead might still act on the living, reinforce the idea that the first victim continued to draw vitality from those who remained. Once this interpretation takes hold, the grave remedy offers a clear sequence of steps. Family members consult neighbors, sometimes clergy or local authorities. A gathering forms. The coffin is opened with some degree of ceremony, never a casual act, always a moment charged with a mixture of fear, hope, and transgression. Observers look for signs that the body has not decayed properly, fluid blood in the heart, organs that appear intact, perhaps a body that seems too well preserved for the time elapsed. Cold climate and particular burial conditions make those appearances plausible, as we've seen. If such signs are found, or sometimes even if they are not, the next step is intervention. Hearts, lungs, or livers are removed. Some accounts mention all three, others focus on the heart alone. The organs are then destroyed, usually by burning. In some cases, as with Rachel Harris and Frederick Ransom, the burning takes place on a blacksmith's forge, a practical choice that also carries symbolic weight, a place of transformation where raw matter turns into something new. In other cases, a fire is built at the grave itself, the organs reduced to ash and scattered or buried. A few communities take the ritual one step further. The ashes of the burned heart are mixed with water or another liquid and given to sick family members to drink. This act is often portrayed by later commentators as especially grotesque, yet to the people involved, it likely fit within a wider tradition of sympathetic cures, where a substance connected to the illness is transformed and ingested as medicine. From their perspective, the ceremony combined the logic of severing a harmful link with the hope of drawing strength from the same source, once purified by fire. Even when no medicinal draught is prepared, the destruction of the organs itself serves as a kind of community therapy. The disease has felt invisible, striking without clear cause, moving from bed to bed. The ritual renders that enemy tangible. People can point to something, the heart in the fire, the smoke rising from the forge, and say that they have acted. In a world where formal medicine offered little hope besides rest and fresh air, This sense of agency mattered. From a modern standpoint, the ritual appears powerless. None of these interventions changed the course of tuberculosis, which continued to spread through shared air and close quarters. Many of the families involved lost additional members after the exhumations. Yet if we focus only on medical effectiveness, we miss what the ritual accomplished within its own cultural frame. It created a script for handling unbearable loss. It told people what to do when the pattern of deaths became too much to bear. Rather than watching passively as another child wasted away, a father could consent to a grave opening, a mother could stand with neighbors around a fire, and a community could tell itself that it had done everything possible, including confronting the body of a loved one in the ground. By the late 19th century, these grave remedies existed alongside emerging public health measures. State boards of health began to track tuberculosis. Newspapers published articles linking the disease to crowded housing and poor ventilation, and doctors increasingly described it in terms of contagion rather than curses. Yet the old explanations did not vanish overnight. In rural pockets of New England, especially in Rhode Island and Vermont, the grave ritual remained a live option well into the 1880s and 1890s. Mercy Brown's case, which we met earlier, is often described as the last of the vampire exhumations, though that is more symbolic than literal. Her exhumation in 1892 drew on a century of regional precedent. George Brown may have doubted the wisdom of opening his daughter's grave, but he lived in a network of neighbors who remembered earlier successes, or at least stories of successes, whenever consumption moved through a household. The ritual came pre-packaged, its steps tested in the minds of those who proposed it. For historians, what emerges from this record is not a scattered collection of bizarre anecdotes, but a coherent folk response to a specific disease environment. When we line up Manchester's forge, Exeter's family plot, Jewett City's burned remains, Griswold's skull and crossbones skeleton, and South Woodstock's college student whose heart fed a blacksmith's fire, we see local variations on a single theme. Communities facing an illness that traveled in families, lingered in homes, and resisted conventional remedies, reached for a pattern of action that made emotional and moral sense, even as it failed medically. This movement through the case files, then, is less about cataloguing gruesome details than about reconstructing a landscape of decision-making. Every exhumation represents a turning point where relatives and neighbors decided that opening a grave was less terrible than doing nothing. The fact that such decisions took place in multiple towns across a century tells us something about how persuasive this logic became when fear, grief, and a long history of revenant stories intersected with the realities of tuberculosis. By the time we step back from these graves, we have more than a list of incidents. We have the outline of a ritual system rooted in love, fear, and a desire to act against an unseen threat. But this system did not appear in a vacuum. The idea that the dead feed on the living was not invented in these villages. It traveled there. By the time people in rural Rhode Island or Vermont started seeing the word vampire in print, the crises attached to that word had already played out somewhere else. Reports arrived from villages along the Habsburg frontier, where families facing the same slow, choking deaths had ended up in the graveyard with shovels and torches. On the page, New England ministers and physicians could watch another set of parents make the turn from helplessness at a sickbed to suspicion of someone already buried. Those memoranda and pamphlets described a choreography that looked uncomfortably familiar. A cluster of deaths in one household. Murmurs that the first to die had not rested. A gathering at the cemetery. Coffins opened, bodies inspected for signs of wrong decay. Hearts pierced or burned, heads severed. The steps differed in detail from town to town, but the emotional movement stayed the same. Grief thickening into fear, fear hardening into action at the grave. For New England readers living with consumption in their own communities, these European cases did more than introduce a strange foreign creature. They offered a template and, just as importantly, a kind of permission. Here were other villages, under imperial scrutiny, that had convinced officials to stand by while desperate families altered the dead in hopes of saving the living. When that pattern crossed the Atlantic in printed form, it carried with it the message that love, fear, and exhumation could belong to the same story, not only on Balkan hillsides, but on New England farms. Long before anyone in Exeter, Rhode Island, thought to cut open Mercy Brown's chest, the idea that a dead family member could prey on the living had already been argued about in Latin, French, and German. The modern image of the vampire begins in these arguments, and they do not start in polished salons. They start in villages. At the beginning of the 18th century, along the military borders of the Habsburg Empire, in what is now Serbia and northern Bosnia, garrison towns faced a grim mix of war, disease, and unstable authority. Here, parish priests, soldiers, and local peasants shared space and suspicion. When someone sickened and died, and then others followed in quick succession, the village did what villages had done quietly for generations. It opened graves. One of the best-known cases clustered around a man whose name moves through the documents with small variations: Arnold Powell. He reportedly died after a fall, was buried, and then, according to neighbors, reappeared at night. People fell ill. After enough funerals, the villagers asked the local authorities to intervene. Officials recorded what followed: grave digging, inspection of bodies, reports of fresh blood, flexible limbs, groans when staked. These claims passed through multiple hands: priests, army officers, court scribes, and eventually into the files of imperial administrators. For the villagers, the logic was not abstract. If the dead were standing in the doorway at night, if families were shrinking in a steady line from bed to grave, something had to be done. The grave supplied the only target they could act upon. They opened the earth, read the signs, and responded according to custom. What makes these early cases different is not their basic logic, it's who chose to write them down. When Habsburg physicians and officers arrived to investigate, they stepped into a world where the rituals already had a script. Families had arguments ready. They knew which graves to suspect, which dates to point to, which relatives they thought were at work. Officials might bring notebooks and Latin phrases about natural causes, but the villagers brought their dead. The reports preserved this collision almost to the level of gesture. The investigators wrote about finding bodies with flexible joints, blood in the chest cavity, or hair and nails that looked longer than when the person was buried. They noted the villagers' insistence that these were proofs of nocturnal feeding. They sometimes added their own explanations: gases, decomposition phases, the peculiar effects of a sealed coffin underground. Yet even skeptical observers occasionally conceded that the bodies looked unnervingly well preserved. When they accepted the villagers' demand to stake or burn the suspected corpse, they did so with a mix of condescension and uneasy curiosity. The act was framed in the paperwork as a concession to popular belief or as a way to calm the community. For the people standing at the grave, however, it was a last resort, a way to protect the living when prayer and medicine had failed. These same documents traveled far beyond the borderlands. Translated, summarized, and printed, they moved into the libraries of men who would never stand beside those pits. Monks, theologians, and physicians debated them in places where disease was familiar and grave opening less so. The most influential of those readers sat in study rooms far from frontier graves. One of them, a French Benedictine named Augustin Calmet, became a kind of clearinghouse for early vampire reports. His work on biblical commentary and church history had already given him a reputation for methodical scholarship. When treatises and letters about vampires began to circulate, he read them with the same habit of cataloguing and comparison. In his volumes, the vampire appears as a puzzle rather than a character. He compiles testimonies from Hungary, Serbia, and other districts, lining up cases of alleged nocturnal visitations, exhumations, and ritual destruction of corpses. He lays out the claims, names sources, and allows space for doubt. The tone is often dry, but the content is anything but. These books made the rounds of educated Europe. They were reviewed, praised, mocked, and reprinted. They filtered into German and English. Critics accused Calmet of giving too much weight to farmer gossip. Defenders argued that ignoring consistent reports of abnormal corpses would be unscientific. The vampire, in these debates, became a test case for how seriously to take the testimony of the poor. In the process, the figure that had once lived purely in local ritual life acquired a new habitat, the printed page. That didn't replace village practice, but it wrapped it in commentary. Every time a case was written up for a city readership, someone had to decide how to frame it. Was it an embarrassment? Proof that peasants clung to pre-Christian fears? A temptation sent by the devil to distract the faithful? Or a sign that there were natural processes the physicians had not yet charted? These choices mattered because they shaped how the story would look when it crossed the ocean. New England ministers and physicians were steeped in European print. Their libraries contained imported sermons, histories, theological debates, and translated curiosities from the continent. Within those pages, the vampire lurked in footnotes and appended cases, part moral lesson, part scientific question. A pastor preparing a sermon on fear of death might come across a miniature report. In some benighted corner of Europe, villagers stake their dead, fearing they rise to suffocate the living. The text would often assure him that enlightened Christians knew better. Still, the image stayed. By the 19th century, references to vampires and vampirism occasionally appeared in American newspapers and journals, usually as sensational snippets from abroad. A column might describe a Balkan village that burned its dead, or a legal debate about whether exhumations should be allowed. These were presented as oddities, a glimpse into darker corners of civilization. For readers in rural New England, the first exposure to a vampire could thus take one of two forms. It might be a case from New England itself, framed as a strange local story, or it might be a European episode, printed as a curiosity. Either way, the word attached itself to a specific pattern: repeated deaths, a suspected corpse, and a ritual performed at the grave. This meant that when tuberculosis swept through their own communities, and families started to whisper that the dead might be drawing the life from the living, they did so in a world where they had already heard, however distantly, about other people behaving the same way. The Atlantic had carried not only goods and families, but a vocabulary of fear. European vampire cases also carried a different set of religious arguments into the conversation. In Catholic districts, the question was often framed explicitly in terms of the soul and the body. If a baptized Christian appeared to be walking after death, what did this say about purgatory, the integrity of burial rites, or the power of the sacraments? Some theologians insisted that such stories must be diabolical illusions, permitted to test the faithful. Others allowed that there might be unusual physical phenomena at work, while refusing to let the dead themselves be accused of conscious malice. Protestant readers, including many in New England, watched these debates with a wary distance. For them, the vampire reports became evidence of Catholic superstition, a sign that reliance on ritual and relics had left those communities vulnerable to imaginative excess. Writers in German and English occasionally used the Balkan cases as a way to argue for stricter rationalism and against what they saw as Romish credulity. Yet the underlying fear, the idea that the dead might, in some fashion, still be entangled with the living, did not respect confessional boundaries. In more than one Protestant region, local variants of the revenant appeared under other names. the corpse that swells and bleeds in the grave, the figure that visits relatives in dreams and leaves them weak in the morning, the Nachtsära that gnaws its shroud while relatives waste away. These motifs circulated across Europe without always carrying the name vampire. When New England families later opened graves, they rarely used that word either. They spoke instead of consumption, the wasting disease, and the fear that someone buried too quickly or under the wrong conditions might still be affecting the home. The printed vampire debates had given educated readers a sharp term for a broader category of fear: the dead who are not done. That category mattered more than the label. When you line up the Old World and New England rituals side by side, the similarities are as instructive as the differences. On one side, villages in the Habsburg borderlands, 17th and 18th centuries. Fear concentrates on recently dead adults, often men, whose bodies show signs of delayed decay. The prescribed remedies include driving stakes through the chest, decapitation, and complete burning of the body. The rituals are sometimes carried out hurriedly at night, sometimes in daylight, often under the uneasy supervision of priests or officers. On the other, towns and farms in New England between roughly 1780 and 1890. Fear often centers on younger family members, and the illness in question is explicitly recognized as consumption. Graves are opened in the presence of relatives and neighbors, sometimes with a doctor recording the procedure. Hearts and lungs are removed, burned on a nearby fire or hearth. The act is referred to not as a magical rite, but as a last chance at a cure. The differences reflect distinct medical and religious landscapes. In Balkan cases, epidemics blur with warfare and famine. The spread of information is patchy. The Church's position is complicated by local custom and imperial politics. In New England, the disease has a name and a recognizable symptom cluster. Ministers and physicians may warn against old country practices, but they often stand near the grave anyway, unwilling to overrule families who have run out of options. The similarities lie in what the rituals promise. Both versions offer a way to restore control over a dying household. If the living are being consumed by something invisible, the grave provides a visible point of intervention. In both cases, the community gathers to witness that intervention, to agree that everything conceivable has been tried. The specific tools, stake, knife, forge, change. The underlying function does not. This is the point at which Old World shadows fall directly across New England ground. When a Vermont or Rhode Island family hears about distant villagers burning their dead to stop a plague, they don't simply file it under foreign superstition. They add it to an unspoken catalogue of what people under pressure have already decided they are capable of doing. There is no single ship, no one moment when the vampire steps onto a New England dock. Instead, what crosses the ocean is a series of fragments. An English translation of Calmet, shelved in a minister's study. A German pamphlet summarized in a Boston journal. A traveler's report about a remote village where graves are opened and bodies burned. A skeptical essay by a European rationalist who includes the grisly details only to dismiss them. These fragments scatter into different minds. A doctor reads one and shrugs at the credulity of peasants. A young seminarian remembers the case when preaching about fear. A printer spots the word vampire and decides it will make a good headline. The details change slightly with each retelling. What remains constant is the core image: a dead person, a sequence of family deaths, and the community's decision to reach back into the grave. We know that some New Englanders were explicitly aware of these European stories because they comment on them in their own writing. A journal entry might record an instance of organ burning with a note that such practices call to mind the tales of vampire superstition abroad. A newspaper might place an account of a local exhumation alongside a shorter clipping from Germany or Hungary. The pairing tells readers how to classify what they are seeing as both local and part of a wider pattern. For families like the Browns, Ransoms, Rays, or Tillinghasts, there is no evidence that they sat around reading French theologians or Balkan case reports. They did not need to. The core practice had already arrived in their region by the late 18th century and taken on a life of its own. But when later observers described what they had done, they reached instinctively for the European vocabulary. The grave remedy became a vampire case. The label flows backward through time, retrofitting a familiar pattern with a name imported from elsewhere. Seen from this angle, the New England vampire panic is less an isolated outbreak of irrationality and more a late echo in a longer European conversation. In Europe, the vampire debates of the 18th century eventually burned themselves out. Physiology advanced, laws were tightened around exhumations, church authorities became less willing to tolerate grave opening based on rumor. The figure did not vanish, it moved. Literature absorbed it. Poets and novelists borrowed the early reports and transformed the night visitor into a character suited for drawing rooms and castles. By the time tuberculosis was killing thousands in New England, European readers were already familiar with the vampire as a figure sliding between rumor and fiction. The same decades that saw families in Rhode Island opening graves also saw serialized tales in which pale aristocrats hovered over fainting heroines. One was rural and desperate, the other was stylized and theatrical. They shared a name, but lived in different emotional climates. This divergence matters because it created a gap between how the people inside the panic understood their actions and how outsiders later chose to remember them. For the families who ordered hearts burned in Vermont or Rhode Island, the act owed more to frontier exhumations than to romantic fiction. For 20th century writers looking back, steeped in literary vampires, the temptation was to fold the grave remedies into a more familiar mythology. The old world's shadows here are double. New England borrowed not only the pattern of ritual from earlier European outbreaks, but also the narratives outsiders used to explain them. When later commentators called the Brown case barbaric or medieval, they were repeating a judgment first leveled by imperial officers against Balkan peasants a century earlier. The investigation, then, is not just about what families did. It is about how those acts were placed within a hierarchy of belief and who had the power to decide which fears counted as ignorance and which counted as science. The European precedent also shaped the limits of what authorities in New England were willing to tolerate. Officials who had read about grave opening controversies abroad knew that exhumations could attract criticism. At the same time, they recognized that trying to forbid desperate families from doing anything could inflame tension. The result, in more than one New England case, was a kind of uneasy truce. If the community insisted, and if the grave opening was done decently and under supervision, it might be overlooked or quietly documented and filed away. This posture has a direct ancestor in those earlier Habsburg reports, where army doctors sometimes authorized a stake or a burning while insisting in their write-ups that natural causes were to blame. In both contexts, officials walked a line between their own convictions and the pressures of people standing in front of them with a specific plea. Let us try this, because nothing else has worked. From the perspective of a family watching their children waste away, the balance of authority looked different. They had heard of others opening graves. They had seen or imagined that these acts sometimes coincided with a slowing of deaths. They knew that waiting quietly and accepting whatever came would feel too much like surrender. When they asked a doctor or minister to stand by a grave, they were not necessarily asking for endorsement of their belief in revenants. They were asking for permission to act without being branded criminals. The European cases had already demonstrated that such permission could be granted, and that the record could be written later in terms palatable to educated audiences. What crosses the ocean, in other words, is a shared choreography. Villagers petition, officials hesitate, a compromise ritual is performed, and the event is subsequently narrated in a language that distances the writer from the fear that drove it. By the time we return to those New England cemeteries, the Manchester hillside, the Ray family plot, the Brown family stone in Exeter, we can see their outlines more clearly because of these older shadows behind them. Their rituals were not copies of Balkan exhumations, but they carried the same logic. When an invisible threat seems to pass from one body to another, the community looks backward to the last buried member and asks whether something there is unfinished. The depiction of that threat changes with culture and theology. Sometimes it is described as a bloated corpse drinking blood. Sometimes it is a loving mother who, through no fault of her own, still presses on the chest of the living at night. Sometimes it is phrased only as that one in the grave who will not rest. New England families drew from the raw material available: graveyard sermons, local stories of earlier exhumations, snippets of printed cases from abroad, and their own long nights at sickbeds. When they finally chose to ask for a grave to be opened, they were standing at the intersection of all of that. The old world had supplied them with evidence that others, under similar pressures, had done the same. It had also supplied a vocabulary of scorn that would later be turned on them. For our purposes, this means that when we look at Mercy Brown's grave, or at the skull and crossbones arrangement of JB55, we are not seeing improvised madness. We are seeing the last iteration, in one corner of North America, of a pattern argued over, documented, and reluctantly permitted across centuries and continents. What remains is to understand how these acts felt from inside a New England household, how fear of disease and love for the dying interacted with imported stories and local custom, how the grave became the one place where all of those pressures could be addressed at once. That interior landscape, the moment between closing the door on the sick room and stepping out into the cold air of the cemetery, belongs to the next turn in the investigation. By the time Mercy Brown's grave had settled back into the winter earth, the world around her family was already changing in ways that would make her story harder to repeat. The disease that killed her had a new name and a new shape in professional minds. On paper and in lecture halls, it was no longer consumption, a wasting that seemed to come from nowhere, but tuberculosis, an infection that moved through air and lived, so doctors argued, in specific tissues under a microscope. The same coughing, the same blood on handkerchiefs, the same emptying of family beds continued for years. What shifted was the explanation, and with it, the rituals that felt acceptable. Seen from a distance, the New England vampire panic did not end with a single sermon or a law. It ended because a different story about the same deaths proved more persuasive, more respectable, and more useful to those who controlled medicine, law, and print. The spell did not shatter, it faded. Hospitals and sanatoria offered one of the first visible replacements for the grave as a site of action. For most of the 19th century, New England families had treated consumption at home. Sick bodies remained in shared bedrooms and front parlors. Visitors came and went. Priests and ministers stood at bedsides. The air was shared, the cough was shared, and the death, when it came, was carried down the front stairs. By the late 1800s, more families with means turned to sanatoria, isolated institutions in the hills, marketed as places where fresh air, careful diet, and structured rest could arrest the disease. The logic behind them mixed older ideas about pure air with newer arguments about contagion, but the effect on ritual was profound. The gravest decisions were no longer made at the edge of a family plot. They were made by doctors who controlled entry and exit from these specialized spaces. Inside their walls, Tuberculosis had rules. Patients were expected to cough into designated cloths or cups. Windows stayed open in all seasons to thin the air. Spitting on floors was prohibited and, in many towns, punishable by fine even outside hospital walls. Spittoons appeared in railway stations and waiting rooms, with small notices explaining the risk. What one generation had watched in bedrooms as an unavoidable family tragedy, the next generation was encouraged to see as something that could be managed. In that new world, the idea that a dead sister might still be feeding on a living brother looked less like a last resort and more like an admission that one did not trust the institution, the doctor, or the new knowledge he claimed. Families who once might have turned to the grave now had other places to invest their desperation. They could write letters to sanatorium directors, appeal for admission, borrow money for travel, place their hope in train schedules and treatment regimens. The more that disease management moved into specialized buildings with their own internal rituals, the less room there was for old measures that required a cemetery and a spade. There was also a quieter shift, happening in notebooks and lecture halls, that never announced itself in the fields of Rhode Island, but still reached them. When Robert Koch announced in 1882 that he had identified the bacillus responsible for tuberculosis, his claim traveled slowly at first. It appeared in German publications, then in translated summaries, then in medical journals read by urban physicians. For years, arguments continued over how decisively his findings explained the disease and what practical measures they justified. New England doctors who read those reports did not immediately abandon older language. They continued to write about phthisis, pulmonary consumption, and decline. They still spoke with families in terms of constitutions, climates, and family weakness. But under those familiar words, a new frame gradually settled in. If a disease had a specific organism, then it had a specific pathway. If it had a specific pathway, it could be blocked, at least in theory. Isolation, ventilation, and spitting laws might sound like small things, but they carried an implicit promise. Action did not need to wait until after burial. The more that physicians treated consumption as a matter of technique, how a room was arranged, how sputum was handled, how long a cough persisted before intervention, the less plausible it became to see the crisis as something only a ritual at a grave could address. The problem did not vanish. New England death registers stayed heavy with TB into the early decades of the 20th century. The difference was that, for educated observers, the causal chain no longer ran from a grave, through a dead family member, into a living one. It ran from lungs to air to lungs again. That rerouting of causality did more than any sermon to dim the old suspicion that the dead might still be at work. Public ridicule finished what new medicine began. The first exhumations discussed in this investigation unfolded in tight circles. Family, minister, local doctor, a few neighbors, perhaps a village official. When they were recorded at all, it was in church registers or private notes. Even in the early 19th century, when Frederick Ransom's heart was burned in Vermont, the event remained largely within local knowledge and a handful of letters. By the middle of the century, that insulation weakened. Newspapers had more space, wider distribution, and a growing appetite for the strange. The Ray family exhumations in Jewett City reached the Norwich Courier, which framed the story as a curiosity. The vocabulary of the report is clinical in places, but its position in the paper, alongside oddities, crimes, and human interest anecdotes, signals something important. To readers in nearby towns and cities, the act of opening family graves and burning hearts was no longer a taken-for-granted remedy. It was already something that could be observed from outside and judged. When outsider eyes arrive, shame often follows. A farmer who consented to an exhumation in 1854 might have told himself he was doing what any responsible head of household should do. The same act, when it appeared in print, invited a different evaluation. It could be treated as evidence of backwardness, of clinging to old country notions in a supposedly enlightened republic. Later in the century, writers like Henry David Thoreau mentioned organ burning in their notebooks as examples of a savage mindset surviving within modern America. That word choice mattered. It aligned the practice with an imagined past that educated readers believed they had left behind. By the time Mercy Brown's case was reported beyond Rhode Island, the tone had cooled from alarm to spectacle. The details that now fascinate historians, the dates, the names, the procedure, first interested newspapers because they showed that something out of step with the age persisted in these rural corners. Once an action is framed as an embarrassment rather than a duty, its future is limited. Few parents want to see their choices described in columns that readers scan for amusement. Fewer still want to imagine their neighbors reading such accounts over breakfast miles away. The turn from local knowledge to regional curiosity did not make grave remedies impossible. It made them increasingly difficult to defend in public and harder to keep entirely private. Each time a case reached print, it taught other families what happened when such things became known. Religious authority also moved, slowly but decisively, away from the old logic. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, ministers and priests appeared in these stories as participants, or at least as tolerated observers. They attended exhumations, offered prayers, or remained carefully neutral while communities tried to stop further deaths. Their scriptures contained rich language about the dead, the body, and the soul. That language could be stretched to accommodate unusual measures in exceptional times. As the 19th century went on, the same religious institutions grew more wary. They were pressured, like physicians, to demonstrate that they belonged to a modern world. Theological journals carried debates about miracles, spirits, and the proper limits of belief. Clergy trained in seminaries that emphasized history, biblical criticism, and engagement with science. A minister who had once accepted grave intervention as a form of desperate piety now risked being seen as irresponsible, even dangerous, if he encouraged or tolerated it. Sermons from the later part of the century increasingly warned congregations against superstitious practices and vain attempts to disturb the rest of the dead. The details of those sermons varied, and many were not written down, but the thrust aligned with the new medical story: trust in providence and in the means God provided through science, rather than in clandestine rituals that resembled folk magic. Religion did not simply abandon those families. Ministers continued to visit consumptive patients, to comfort the bereaved, to bury the dead. Yet their role in any decision to open a grave changed. Instead of providing a blessing at the edge of the pit, they were more likely to argue that the dead should remain undisturbed and that the living should seek help in clinics, hospitals, or prayer, not in shovels and fire. That shift closed another avenue through which the grave remedy had once drawn legitimacy. When an act is no longer framed as pious, or at least tolerable by religious authorities, it becomes harder to justify even to oneself. Law and custom, too, began to converge on the same point. The dead should lie still. In earlier periods, small communities often treated their burial grounds as extensions of family property. Plots were tended by relatives, stones were set and repaired by local craftsmen or by the families themselves, and the idea of opening a grave for exceptional reasons did not necessarily feel like a trespass. Permission existed in a grey zone of mutual understanding. The gradual professionalization of death altered that arrangement. Undertakers, embalming, and commercial funerals moved the body, at least briefly, into the care of specialists. Cemeteries incorporated as companies or associations, with rules about plot ownership, maintenance, and access. Local ordinances governed when graves could be opened and under what conditions. The concern behind many of these changes was public health and order rather than vampire belief, but the effect was the same. The act that families once carried out under local supervision now touched a web of regulations and expectations. Digging into a grave without clear legal authority risked more than social judgment. It could trigger fines, disputes with cemetery boards, or, in rare cases, criminal charges. Even if those consequences remained uncommon, the knowledge that they existed created a barrier that had not been present in earlier generations. At the same time, embalming changed the visible appearance of corpses in ways that cut against older signs of vampirism. Bodies treated with chemical preservatives did not show the same pattern of delayed decay that winter burial once produced. The unusual redness of lips, the presence of liquid blood in the chest, details that had frightened earlier witnesses, became less pointed as embalming fluid, and undertakers' techniques imposed a different, standardized stillness. The more that death looked like something managed by professionals, the less room there was for interpretations anchored in the intimate observation of corpses by family and neighbors. If relatives saw the body only briefly in a prepared state, then surrendered it to coffin and ground under the supervision of paid staff, there was less opportunity for the kind of unsettling, semi-preserved sight that earlier exhumations had revealed. Law, commerce, and technique converged here in an unplanned alliance against the vampire. Through all of these changes, families still carried the memory of what they had done, or, in some cases, what their parents or grandparents had done. In the 20th century, folklorists and historians visiting New England towns encountered descendants who knew, in outline, that a relative's heart had once been burned. The knowledge surfaced in cautious conversations, fragments of story, offhand remarks, when trust had been established. Some of those descendants described the act as something that had to be done at the time, a choice made in extremity. Others presented it as an embarrassment, a story told with a defensive smile or a shrug. A few claimed no knowledge at all until an outsider arrived with an old newspaper clipping or church record that forced the past back into view. Silence itself is a kind of commentary. If the grave remedy had remained honorable in local memory, families would have told the story more openly as an example of their ancestors' courage or ingenuity. The fact that so many stories survived only as half-remembered whispers says something about how the practice came to be seen. It moved from the category of difficult but necessary into best left unspoken. That emotional reframing did not change the fact that hearts had been burned. It changed what those acts meant within family identity. Ancestors who once appeared as protectors could, under new eyes, look like people who had desecrated their dead. As generations turned, the narrative softened again. The sense of direct responsibility faded with the passing of those who had participated. What remained was a more abstract, almost folkloric curiosity. They say that back then, in this town, people dug up their dead to stop consumption. The act itself slipped toward legend, even as it stayed anchored to specific names and graves. While the folk remedy faded, the word vampire underwent its own transformation. The Old World reports that Calmet Red and the New England exhumations, described in newspapers, still spoke about something blunt. A corpse, physically present in its grave, imagined as the ongoing source of harm. The rituals that followed were designed to change the condition of that corpse. They were intimate, bloody, and agricultural in setting. By the time Mercy Brown's story entered broader awareness, Bram Stoker had already published Dracula. Stoker's creation drew on some of the same European reports that had shaped earlier debates. but it rearranged them into a very different figure, a mobile, aristocratic predator who traveled across borders, seduced victims, and symbolized many fears at once. His vampire moved through drawing rooms and city streets. He spoke, planned, and resisted. Against that new figure, the New England practice of opening a grave and burning a heart seemed strangely literal and static. There was no cloak in Exeter, no castle, no hypnosis. There was just a cold cemetery, a dead daughter, a sick brother, and a fire. In a sense, the rise of the literary vampire crowded out the older, more local logic. The word vampire came to evoke Stoker's creation more readily than anonymous villagers' fears about half-decayed corpses. Later audiences, meeting Mercy Brown's case through newspaper retrospectives or oddities of history columns, could not help but imagine her in the shadow of Dracula. The misalignment between those images reinforced the sense that the Rhode Island ritual belonged to a mental world that no longer matched the word attached to it. What had once been a desperate experiment in disease management now looked, through 20th century eyes, like an episode in a pre-existing genre. If the vampire panic ended, it did so not with a proclamation, but with accumulated incompatibilities. The household world that had made the grave remedy imaginable, shared bedrooms, weak medical explanations, porous boundaries between churchyard and family property, gave way to one where disease traveled through wires, papers, and institutions. Coughs were measured against bacteriological theories. Graves were bound tighter by law and commerce. Religious authority aligned itself more firmly with restraint, and print cast an unflattering light on those who still acted as if the dead could be stopped with fire. In that context, the question that opened this investigation, how a father in Rhode Island could agree to burn his daughter's heart, becomes easier to place. He stood near the end of a line. George Brown made his decision in a moment when older and newer stories about disease overlapped. The grave remedy remained visible in local memory, supported by precedent and by neighbors who remembered earlier cases. At the same time, the first outlines of germ theory and public health campaigns were already in circulation. Mercy's exhumation belongs to that narrow window where both explanatory systems were active enough to claim plausibility. After that window closes, the same disease continues to kill, but the menu of acceptable responses no longer includes a spade and a fire under a winter sky. This does not mean the underlying emotional forces vanished. Love, terror of losing another child, the feeling that unseen forces were stalking a household, those remained. They simply attached themselves to different practices: hospital visits, sanatorium applications, charitable appeals, fervent prayers, and later, vaccinations and antibiotics. The vampire, as a literal explanation for clustered deaths, receded. As a metaphor and a literary figure, it intensified. The ritual that once addressed it became unthinkable inside the new order. In the graveyards of New England, there is no clear boundary stone marking the last heart that was burned. The timeline narrows into silence after the 1890s. Cases appear in scattered reports, then disappear behind the smoother surface of 20th century death certificates. What remains are the traces: rearranged bones in a Connecticut hillside, newspaper columns about strange doings in country cemeteries, family stories told in low voices, and the path of one girl's name as it travels from a local tragedy into articles, books, and the imaginations of those who stand at her grave. The fading of the spell matters as much as its casting. It shows not only how communities once tried to make sense of illness with the tools they had, but how those tools can be taken away, not by force, usually, but by the slow establishment of different explanations, different authorities, and different ways of being respectable. The next steps of the investigation will move from the silence of the grave into the noise of the legend. We will see how scattered reports were absorbed, reworked, and transformed into a story that sits far from the fields of Exeter, but still carries the image of a winter grave. On some autumn evenings, the little cemetery in Exeter feels less like a place of mourning and more like a stage. Headlights sweep across the stone wall. Car doors slam. A small group walks up the hill with flashlights and phone screens glowing, laughter just a little too loud for a graveyard. Someone has a pair of cheap plastic fangs still in the package. Someone else carries a grocery bag with candles, a marker, a handful of coins. They pause at a modest, pale granite stone, Mercy L. At its base, objects have accumulated: ticket stubs, plastic flowers, coins gone dull in the weather, the crumpled wrapper from cough drops, folded notes stuck under pebbles. Depending on the year, there might be a scribbled message about America's last vampire, or a dare scrawled in black permanent marker. Photos are taken. A story is told, half remembered from some website, half improvised on the spot, about a girl who came back from the grave to drain her brother's life. For the people on that hill tonight, Mercy is an experience, a spooky stop on a late-night drive, a story to post, a way to feel the October season more intensely. For the ground under their feet, nothing has changed. It is the same patch of earth where, in 1892, a father and a physician stood in full daylight and opened a coffin because they thought it might save the last living child in the family. The distance between those two scenes, an emergency in a village and a legend trip in a car, is what this part of the investigation has to account for. How did a regional response to tuberculosis become a story about vampires that people now visit for fun? The first step in that transformation happened almost immediately. It began with ink. In March 1892, a correspondent from the Providence Journal made the trip out to Exeter. The Brown family and their neighbors described what they meant to do in plain language. They were looking for the cause of consumption, the mysterious force that kept moving from one brown body to the next. The local doctor, Harold Metcalf, approached the exhumation as a clinical procedure. The newspaper did something else. The article carried all the practical details, names, dates, the sequence of deaths, but wrapped them in a tone halfway between medical report and Gothic feature. The old folk explanation that something dead could still be drawing life from the living now found itself next to words that belonged more to European pamphlets than to New England farm talk. The paper did not invent the idea of a harmful dead relative. It did help fix those graves in the public imagination as a spectacle. Other papers followed. By the time the story had been reprinted in Boston and beyond, the balance had shifted further. Editorials in more urban, self-consciously modern towns treated Exeter as a kind of time capsule of ignorance. One Connecticut writer, summarizing the case, complained that such episodes showed how thin the veneer of civilization really was in rural districts. From the point of view of Exeter's neighbors, the exhumation was an agonizing last resort. From the point of view of distant readers, it could be framed as a curiosity, a cautionary tale about what happens when people cling to superstition. The panic had already begun to shed some of its context and put on its first costume. A few years later, the story took another step away from its origins. This time it happened in a journal that rarely concerned itself with small New England farms. In 1896, the anthropologist George R. Stetson published an article in American Anthropologist on what he called vampirism in New England. He gathered several cases, Rhode Island exhumations, Connecticut grave burnings, and laid them alongside one another the way a naturalist might arrange specimens. The Brown family did not occupy the whole article, but their case sat inside a larger pattern Stetson was trying to describe. On the page, the practice no longer looked like a desperate improvisation by specific families facing specific losses. It appeared as a survival, the kind of ritual scholars like to treat as a leftover from an older mental world. Stetson's language, like that of many writers in his era, could be harsh. He cast the participants as people clinging to relics of barbarous superstition under the thin mask of modern life. Yet his article also did something important for this investigation. It pinned the New England customs to the same conceptual board as the Balkan cases he had read about in European sources. The fears in Exeter and Jewett City now shared a label with the fears on the Habsburg frontier. That label was no longer consumption cure or grave remedy. It was vampirism. Once the word appeared in a prestigious journal, it traveled. Clergy, physicians, and educated lay readers encountered it the way they encountered missionary reports or medical case studies. Some would have been struck by how closely the New England accounts resembled the European memoranda we traced earlier. Clustered deaths, suspiciously intact corpses, ritual damage to graves. The story had moved another step away from the brown kitchen table and into the circuits of print. As those circuits expanded, the line between report and fiction began to blur. By the late 19th century, European readers had already seen the Paole case and other frontier investigations debated in theological works and newspapers. New World readers were starting to see them too. Translations of vampire reports, summaries of Balkan outbreaks, and essays on revenants appeared in English-language periodicals. Those texts crossed the Atlantic on the same steamships that carried sermons, scientific treatises, and serialized novels. The Mercy Brown episode entered that stream. In fact, we now know that New England vampires touched the masterwork of the genre directly. A clipping about the Rhode Island cases was found among the working papers of Bram Stoker. As he drafted Dracula, the real panic in Exeter was sitting on his desk, serving as raw material for the aristocratic predator we analyzed earlier. A few decades later, another Providence writer, H.P. Lovecraft, gave the town its own unsettling house, where a wasting disease and whispers about something wrong in the cellar blur together. One of the women in his extended family had died of consumption. He lived in a city where the Mercy Brown story still circulated quietly as a local weird tale. When he described lingering presences and strange decay in an old New England dwelling, he was writing in a landscape already marked, if only faintly, by exhumed hearts and anxious neighbors. By the early 20th century then, the panic existed in two forms at once. In family memories and local archives, it remained a story about consumption, grief, and desperate measures. In the wider literary imagination, it had become raw material, a set of images, clustered graves, opened coffins, ritual burns that could be turned into Gothic atmosphere. Inside the families themselves, the story moved differently. If you follow the paper trail forward from 1892 into the first half of the 20th century, you see fewer headlines about exhumations, fewer newspaper editorials about vampires. Tuberculosis slowly loses its hold as new treatments arrive. Germ theory settles deeper into public life. Public health campaigns reshape how people talk about disease. Within the Brown family, however, the exhumation does not vanish. It reappears in quieter ways. A newspaper clipping saved in a box, a scrap of remembrance written on the back of a photograph, an older relative's story told to a grandchild on Memorial Day when they visit the plot. When modern folklorists sit at Brown family kitchen tables almost a century later, they find that Mercy's name still surfaces, but often as Lena, the domestic nickname, not as the last vampire. The tone in those memories varies. Some descendants treat the event with a kind of grim understanding. People did what they thought might help. There was no cure. Others convey embarrassment or frustration at how the story has been framed by outsiders. They are aware that, somewhere out there, strangers trade on their relative as a spooky anecdote. They insist instead on recalling her as a person who liked particular foods, who had a favorite quilt, who coughed and faded over months in a small, drafty house. Beyond the Browns, similar dynamics appear. Families in Rhode Island and Connecticut, who once exhumed Nancy Young or the Ray Men in Jewett City, do not form clubs of vampire descendants. They fold those events into local lore, family shame, or family explanation. In some households, the ritual becomes an example of how ignorant people once behaved, used to mark a line between past and present. In others, it is hardly mentioned at all. By the middle of the 20th century, you can walk through many of these cemeteries and see no obvious sign that anything unusual ever happened. Stones lean, names erode. The panic has left scars in the soil and in old ledger books, but they are not visible to a casual passerby. The practice has ended. The language that once justified it, about consumption and drawing the life from relatives, has gone quiet. The next phase begins when outsiders go looking for those scars. In the early 1990s, children playing near a gravel pit in Griswold, Connecticut, found human bones eroding out of a hillside. Archaeologists soon uncovered a small family cemetery. Most of the burials looked ordinary for the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Wooden coffins, simple arrangements. One grave did not. The skeleton inside, the same J=B-55 we encountered earlier in the historical records, had been rearranged after death. The skull had been placed down among the ribs. The femurs were crossed beneath it in a deliberate X. Forensic analysis later showed signs of tuberculosis in the bones. For archaeologists, this grave confirmed what old newspaper clippings and journal articles had suggested. People in New England had once opened graves and physically altered bodies because they believed something in those bodies still threatened the living. For this investigation, the Griswold find marks the point where the panic re-enters public consciousness, not through rumor or local gossip, but through science journalism and museum exhibits. Around the same time, a folklorist named Michael Bell was driving the back roads of Rhode Island and Connecticut, conducting a statewide folklife survey. When he asked people to tell him about unusual local stories or customs, a few mentioned vampires. That word was often delivered with a half smile or a careful glance, as if the teller were testing how seriously he would take it. Bell did not treat the cases as jokes. He tracked down family records, walked through overgrown cemeteries, and knocked on doors. In Exeter, he met Brown descendants who still had objects connected to Mercy's illness: a quilt, photographs, clippings. Some relatives declined to speak on camera or for print. Others agreed, but insisted that the story be told in a way that acknowledged both the medical context and the emotional cost. When Bell finally published his work under the title Food for the Dead, On the Trail of New England's Vampires, he chose that phrase deliberately. It echoed both old-world vampire lore and the New England logic that the dead could feed on their relatives. But his case studies pushed back against the easy mockery that had colored earlier accounts. He framed the rituals as rational attempts to make sense of slow, inexplicable deaths in an era before antibiotics. In doing so, he altered the trajectory of the legend. Instead of a simple story about crazy farmers burning hearts, readers now had access to a more layered picture: TB epidemiology, folkloric transmission, psychological strain, and local memory all interwoven. The panic had re-emerged in print, but with more of its original texture restored. Parallel to that scholarly work, a different kind of rediscovery was underway: tourism and legend tripping. By the late 20th century, cemeteries associated with vampire cases began appearing in ghost tour guidebooks and regional Weird New England collections. Mercy's grave, in particular, attracted attention. It was relatively easy to find, attached to a name that sounded almost too on the nose for a horror story. Articles and TV segments started calling her America's Last Vampire, a phrase designed for magazine covers and Halloween specials, rather than for precise historical description. As more visitors arrived, the site itself changed. The original brown headstones suffered repeated thefts and vandalism, to the point that the town eventually installed a sturdier marker and took extra measures to protect it. Local police found themselves in the odd position of patrolling a small rural cemetery, not because of grave robbers in the traditional sense, but because of teenagers and late-night thrill-seekers. One such visit ended in a fatal car crash on the way back from the hill, a stark reminder that the risks around the grave now came from the living, not the dead. Offerings left at Mercy's stone multiplied. Some echoed the medical history, a packet of cough drops, a small bottle of cough syrup. Others leaned into the pop culture image, plastic fangs, cartoonish vampire figures, notes thanking her for being cool. Depending on the year, the accumulation could feel more like the rail at a concert venue than a family grave. For many Exeter residents, this transformation created an uncomfortable duality. On one hand, the town gained a strange sort of fame. On the other, neighbors watched strangers treat a local woman's grave as a seasonal attraction. Folklorists who returned to the cemetery over years heard both reactions: pride at being part of an unusual story, and resentment that the human losses underneath had been turned into a backdrop for selfies. This is the moment when the panic fully becomes legend. A practice that once lived in kitchens and barns, whispered between relatives and neighbors as they tried to stop a disease, has shifted into a story people consume. It is arranged in listicles, retold on paranormal podcasts, reenacted in low-budget documentaries. Certain elements get repeated every time: opened grave, burned heart, vampire label. Other parts, months of caring for the sick, the smell of TB wards, the grinding poverty of subsistence farms, drop out of frame. Seen from this angle, the movement from panic to legend follows a recognizable pattern. First, something happens at a local scale: a cluster of deaths, an improvised ritual, an act that simultaneously horrifies and comforts the people who perform it. Then, someone writes it down, sometimes to inform, sometimes to judge, sometimes to marvel. Those texts travel outward. Along the way, they pick up new emphases and lose others. A label from one cultural context, in this case vampire, gets welded onto behaviors that originally grew out of a different vocabulary of consumption and wasting. Next, the episode enters arenas that care more about story than about strict documentation. Sermons looking for vivid examples, treatises seeking striking cases, novels and short stories hungry for imagery. Eventually, modern media industries arrive. They extract the parts that work best on posters, thumbnails, or tour brochures and let the rest sink back into the archive. In Exeter's case, the process has not erased the original panic. It sits underneath the legend like a palimpsest. When visitors stand at Mercy's grave for more than a few minutes, the noise of the legend, vampire merch, ghost hunter hashtags, can give way to something quieter. There is the line of names on the stones, 3 deaths from consumption in quick succession, one more grave dug for a young woman who had already been exhumed once. There is the memory, still alive in family stories, of a father who agreed to open his daughter's coffin because he was out of options. From the vantage point of this investigation, the journey from panic to legend is not just a curiosity about how stories spread. It is a test of how modern audiences relate to the suffering of people in the past. When we call Mercy America's Last Vampire, we inherit all the print pathways and scholarly debates and horror novels that carried that word to her plot. We also inherit a responsibility to see the consumption ward behind the coffin, the crooked farmhouse door behind the cemetery gate, and the human beings whose emergency has become our folklore. The panic is gone, the legend remains. But if there is a final meaning to extract from this investigation, it lies here. Beliefs that look strange from a distance often emerge from very familiar pressures. The fear that someone we love is suffering unnecessarily. The inability to accept that nothing more can be done. The willingness to damage one thing in the hope of saving another. Those pressures produced a ritual in which the living stood over the open chest of someone they had buried and tried to protect the ill by wounding the dead. They produced, at Chestnut Hill, a modest stone that now draws visitors who arrive thinking of folklore and leave, if they have been paying attention, thinking of families. Mercy Brown is neither monster nor mascot. She is what she always was, a young woman who died of a very real illness in a small Rhode Island town. Standing in front of her stone, surrounded by the offerings of people who come to visit a story, we are finally close enough to see the truth. We can see how easily fear draws a straight line from a cough in a farmhouse bedroom to a fire at the edge of the grave.